Wherever you are in the world, Ford has got an arch rival. In America, it's GM. In Australia, it's Holden. And in Britain, it's Vauxhall. And the Ford versus Vauxhall battle in the UK came to a head in the 1970s when their family saloons were duking it out for superiority. From Ford, the Mk3 Cortina, and from Vauxhall, the Mk1 Cavalier. We're coming up on a 50-year anniversary for the Cavalier, and in 2022, both these companies have announced that they're pulling out of the saloon car game altogether. So now, which is best? But first, our friends at Lancaster Insurance are running monthly giveaways. You can win all sorts, from experience days to tools, restaurant vouchers and tech. So check the video description for full details and to enter.
George Bernard Shaw that said the US and the UK were two countries divided by a common language. But one thing they do have in common is their love of cars, shown no more clearly than in the styling influences of both countries. And in fact, many a UK-derived car borne its design cues from our friends across the pond. Look at the Mk1 Cortina and its dramatic rear wings, very Americana-esque. US-inspired styling cues made a welcome return in 1970 with this, the Mk3 Cortina. I mean, look at it, it's glorious. That dramatic front end, its sort of sculpted bonnet, that pronounced Coke bottle hip, and the way that the boot lid sort of sleeks away. It's just great. It's a lovely look. That US influence also made its way into the interior, and it's safe to say that the interior of the Mk3 initially didn't go down as universally as well as the rest of the car. So much so that in late 1973, Ford hastily introduced a facelift, which saw the new interior that you see here, which was then largely carried forward into the Mk 4 and Mk 5. It's a more subdued interior, but I have to say it does generally work very well. The mechanicals as well. The Mk3 Cortina was the first Ford, over here in Europe at least, that had coil springs and double wishbone suspension up front and a live axle and coil springs at the back. The wheelbase was longer by 3.5 inches, and it was also 2.5 inches wider than the Mk 2, and yet it retained the same overall length. So the Mk3 Cortina had excellent packaging, so much so that Ford not only replaced the Mk 2 Cortina but also the more expensive Corsair range. So when the Mk3 Cortina came out in 1970, the 1.3 and 1.6 Kent engines were carried over from the Mk 2, but the 2-litre Pinto was all new. And there was a 4-speed manual gearbox and a 3-speed auto, and with prices starting at just under £1,000, the Mk3 Cortina was competitively priced. And of course the formula was a success. In the 6 years that the Mk3 Cortina was on sale, they shifted over 1 million of these, 1.1 million units. And if you think about it, the success of the Mk3 ultimately spawned the subsequent success of the Mk 4 and Mk 5 Cortinas. While they had very staid styling compared to the Americana-esque Mk 3, it was fundamentally the same car, and of course that carried on successfully through to 1982 when it was replaced by the Sierra. Ford therefore dominated the sales charts in the way that Vauxhall could never do with the Cavalier, certainly in the 70s. I think Ford hit a sweet spot with the Mk 3, I really do. I like the styling, I also like the mechanical simplicity of the car. This is the 1.6 engine, so it's no ball of fire, but it's refined enough and it's eager enough to mean making progress down modern roads is fine. I love the mechanical precision of the 4-speed manual gearbox. The steering is light but direct. The one thing it did get criticised for was its handling. It's a bit rolly. Of course, what that does bestow it with is a fantastically soft and compliant ride, which on modern pothole roads, that's an absolute blessing. Yeah, you don't want to hustle a car like this along particularly, but as I say, the ride comfort is exceptional. And while the fascia is not as dramatic as the early versions of the Mk 3, I have to say it all works very well. The ergonomics are spot on. I've got the heater controls and the radio close to hand, the stalks are well positioned. It all works really well. You can see why Ford really landed on their feet. This car could appeal to families and fleet customers alike. The sales numbers basically don't lie. The Mk 3 deserved its success, absolutely, with an excellent model lineup, excellent range of engines, good suspension, it was all very reliable, it was competitively priced, it all worked. You can see why the Mk3 Cortina really put Ford on the map in the 70s.
The Cortina had turned out to be Ford's prodigal child. The Mk1 had shaken up the family saloon and the rep car market. The Mk2, despite changing basically nothing, had become Britain's best-selling car. And the Mk3, despite initial supply issues with that factory strike at launch, had once again become Britain's best-selling car. Now, by the mid-70s, Vauxhall had had enough and decided to challenge the Cortina. But unlike Ford, who'd spent tens of millions developing the Mk3, Vauxhall simply didn't have that kind of money for an all-new project. So they turned to their European allies, Opel, who offered them the Ascona, their challenger to the Ford Taunus, which is of course what the Cortina was called on the European market. To differentiate Vauxhall's new car with its Ascona counterpart, they brought in an American designer, Wayne Cherry to be exact, to graft the nose from the Opel Manta onto the Ascona Saloon, to create what Vauxhall would now be calling the Cavalier. The result was a really rather handsome looking car. It's certainly not as radical as the Mk3 Cortina had been with its US inspired styling, but it's neat and it's sharp without being unusual, which for the conservative fleet buying market is perfect. At the 1975 Earls Court Motor Show, the new Cavalier was unveiled. And here's a little bit of trivia for you. It was this Cavalier, this actual one I'm driving now, was on the Earls Court Motor Show stand in 1975. How's that for Providence? The public flocked to the new Vauxhall because it had come along at just the right time. By 75, we were nearly 6 years into the Mk3 Cortina's life, past its peak popularity. It was a bit staid, a bit familiar, and in many ways quite outdated. The new Vauxhall didn't do anything radical or revolutionary, but it was modern and sharp and crisp, exactly what the market wanted. When they got hold of the Cavalier, What Car magazine compared it highly favourably to the Morris Marina and the Mk3 Cortina. They liked its smooth ride, its refinement, its practicality, and how remarkably capable in the corners it was. So were they right? Well, driving this extremely early Mk1 Cavalier, I think they were. Let's start with the way it handles. The steering is so much more precise than the Cortina, which with that enormous steering wheel is like captaining a ship. The steering's light and direct, you've got a lot more idea where the front of the car is actually going than the Cortina, and whilst it is still a soft, comfortable ride, I'm certainly not having my teeth shaken out, it's more composed than the Ford. It doesn't pitch and wallow nearly as much, and I've got the confidence to drive that little bit faster. It's still not a sports saloon, but there's one thing for sure, it's a lot tighter and a lot sharper and a lot less boat-like than the slightly wallowy Mk3 Cortina. But it's still comfortable, it's still relaxing, and it doesn't have quite the droniness at higher speeds that you get in the Ford. It just feels that little bit more modern, more grown up. Then there's the engine. This 1.9 was the biggest engine you could get in the Cavalier at launch, and it's lovely, nice and torquey, pulls you along confidently, and it is way smoother and more refined than the slightly harsh crossflow that you get in the Cortina, for example. The prime market for the Cavalier was the fleet buyer, and it hit that mark perfectly. The orders were coming in by the thousand, and even operating at full capacity. The Opel factory in Antwerp just couldn't keep up with demand for these cars. After 2 years, Vauxhall and Luton were finally given the green light to start building them in Britain, and at the same time, they introduced the 1.3 litre engine from the Viva. With Luton building cars at full capacity, supply finally met demand, and once it did, the Cavalier got into and then maintained a top 10 bestsellers spot every year it was in production in Mk1 guys. Vauxhall sold just under 240,000 of these cars. And after that point, the Cortina started floundering. Ford didn't really make any significant leaps forward with their family saloon until the Sierra came along in the mid-80s. The Mk1 Cavalier in many ways wasn't really anything special, but by being so all-round competent, doing everything so well, and coming along at just the right moment, Vauxhall made their mark and reasserted their dominance as a genuine competitor to Ford. Say what you will about Vauxhall's modern output of dreary SUV after dreary SUV, but the Cavalier is proof that back in the 70s, Vauxhall really stood for something.
So Joe, two very closely aligned rivals. I'm keen to know what you thought.
I am very surprised because you all know I love the Mk3 Cortina. I think it's a fabulous car, arguably one of Ford's best. But this feels fantastic. It's a really, really nice driving car, and in many ways feels a lot more modern than that does, I think.
Well, of course, it should do. It came out 5 years
Very
later.
true.
They only overlap by about 9 or 10 months, I believe, from when that was launched and this was replaced by the Mark IV.
It really caught Ford napping, and like we said, it came along at just the right moment. Maybe the Ford's not all it's cracked up to be. For as much as we often don't give Vauxhall the attention they deserve, there are some real crackers in their back catalogue. We must give a massive, massive thank you to Richard from the Cavalier and Chevette Club, who's brought this car down for us today, because it's superb, almost completely original. But we do have to pick a winner.
We do, and I've got to say, I've always overlooked the Mark 1 Cavalier.
As have I.
You shouldn't rule that out. It's a really competent package. I think it looks great. Mechanically, it's solid.
It feels more modern as well, I would say.
If you were to compare these two in the mid-70s, my allegiances to the Blue Oval would still remain, and I will therefore pick the Mk3 Cortina, but it's a very, very close run battle.
I would agree. The trouble is, I have no allegiances to Ford, as you know. I've got no brand loyalty there. But I love this car. But purely objectively, as we must try and be, for we are car journalists, from an objective standpoint, the Cavalier is the superior car. So, sorry to say, Ford fans, my vote's with the Vauxhall. But let us know in the comments, Blue Oval or Griffin, which one does it for you? This video is proudly sponsored by Lancaster Insurance. Give them a call on 01480 400 889 for an insurance quote on your classic car. And don't forget to click the link in the video description to enter their latest competition.